My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old-school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, haphazardly fancy locations, pasty immortals, a vast tangle of psychological barbs, and more outlandish paths than seems feasible. No, not a late 90s vampire LARP. It's the Gardens of Ynn.
Our first segment is the Basic Crawl. The Gardens of Ynn is an adventure designed for old-school role-playing games and their modern cousins. It was written by Emmy Cavegirl Allen. The artwork is entirely public domain. The first part of the book is the introduction, where we are told that the Gardens of Ynn appear, quote, as a vast garden, now untended, overrun, and fallen into ruin. Once, this place was a realm of rarefied luxury, but its masters are long dead, and the machinery that maintained it has fallen into disrepair. The introduction includes some information about how your characters may know about the gardens and how to get into them. Importantly, the introduction tells us how this adventure is meant to be run. Essentially, you will map out Ynn every time the players visit it. Whenever they enter a new location, they select one of the following three options. Stay here, meaning they're going to stay at that location, in which case events begin to trigger. Go deeper, in which case the GM rolls up a new location and some details to go along with that location, and then connects it up to his map with a line. Or go back, in which case the players may retrace their steps. A key thing to remember about the gardens, the locations shift and rearrange every time the players visit, meaning there is no need to roll up locations ahead of time. The introduction continues with a few notes about various environmental concerns in the Gardens of Ynn, including the rules for camping and magic, as well as a terrific section on the inhabitants of Ynn, including the radiant, nearly extinct beings who created the gardens, the Seetha, as well as our first hint of the monstrosity known as the Idea of Thorns. Finally, the introduction section gives us the various tables we will need for generating locations and encounters.
The next section of the book, Part 2, which comprises roughly a fourth of the text, is the detailed descriptions of the locations that are listed in the earlier table. And here we learn about the gazebos, orchid houses, mausoleums, and other places that make the Gardens of Ynn what they are. Part 3 is called Location Details. These are also rolled from a table found in Part 1 and include short descriptions of the various ways you can change or alter the locations from Part 2, such as the place being frozen, riddled with chasms, adorned with silver filigree, having exposed clockwork parts, and much more. Part 4 is the bestiary, which includes creatures both fantastical and mundane, and this is also where the dreadful Idea of Thorns is detailed. Part 5 is called Useful Tables, and indeed includes useful tables, such as tables for alterations, which are strange mutations various characters and creatures can have. And Part 5 also includes information on Ynnian changelings, and how these characters function as replacement player characters should yours die in the gardens, and information about what happens if the Idea of Thorns should reach the real world.
Well, let's talk about how we have used this, if we have used it in our games. Tom?
I have not. I've merely gotten overexcited by the preview document that was on Drive-Thru and reading about it on Emmy's blog, and then read it. And I think I'd like to slightly take credit for letting people on the Gauntlet know about it, but I'm not sure if I can quite claim that honor.
I have not run the Gardens of Ynn, but I have been a player in 2 sessions that were run by Gauntlet community member Horst Wurst. Things we liked. Okay, I'd like to kick this off, Tom, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I think that the Gardens of Ynn is the best use of public domain art I have ever seen in a role-playing game product. There was, I want to say like 4 or 5 years ago, some organization in your land of origin made a whole bunch of public domain images available for people to use, and every role-playing game, every tiny press role-playing game for like months after that used all of this public domain art. And it led to a lot of products that frankly look like, to me, like a haphazard mess. I wish that some of the stuff just had no art rather than a bunch of like completely incongruent public domain art. Now, having said that, this book actually uses it to really great effect. I think that Emmy has, assuming Emmy picked out the art, Emmy has chosen images that are very consistent with one another. Everything has a sort of Art Nouveau quality to it, which I think is very appropriate for the setting of the Gardens of Ynn, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit more. And so, yeah, I found myself like super impressed by that aspect of the book. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. Now that you mention it, because I was looking at it earlier, and I know that somewhere in there are some, I think, Aubrey Beardsley illustrations, but I couldn't work out which ones they were just from looking at them, which I think proves your point that they've been very carefully selected to present the same kind of aesthetic all the way through.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. And so kudos on that. What did you like about the book? I liked other things as well, but I just want to throw that out there first because it's kind of a basic thing. Tom, what do you like about the book?
Well, I mean, I just love the tone. Like I said, I was hooked by the intro, like the preview that was made available. It was just an instant buy for me, a few dollars in PDF. Because of that, there's sort of a tone which is quite hard to define. Maybe we'll explore that as we go along a bit, but a little bit kind of wistful, kind of it reminds me a lot of, actually it reminds me of a particular children's book I read that must have been from like the 30s or 40s and British, but in a very appropriate way. I cannot remember the title or plot of it, but I remember there was a bit at the beginning about a yellow gate appearing in a wall, which later on in the story disappears, and someone going through it and there being a garden inside. And it wasn't The Secret Garden or Tom's Secret Garden, which are two different books, because I'm pretty sure they're from the Victorian-ish era, and this had cars in it. But this idea of like kind of hidden spaces, manicured lawns, impoverished aristocratic houses going to seed, statues with ivy growing on them, this whole kind of slightly melancholy post, like what would happen if everybody left Wonderland after Alice had been there and then you went back to visit and it was just nighttime all the time and it was a bit empty and kind of, yeah. It's this very hard to define aesthetic, which you see a lot in things like, the Chronicles of Narnia, all the real world bits in that, exploring hidden spaces, crawling into wardrobes and the like. I think it's in that kind of vein. And it reminds me in that of another adventure we've talked about in a previous episode, The Lies of the Child Kingdom, which I think identified a genre of fantasy that maybe hasn't really been treated as a single thing before. And what Emmy Allen has done rather brilliantly is kind of find this thread that goes through all these different books and presumably films and TV shows and poems as well, and kind of made it and distilled it rather into this one piece of work.
I agree completely. I'm not sure how I can add to that any more eloquently. I agree 100%. I mean, people who know me know that I am a huge fan of OSR stuff that is gross. I love body horror. I love exploding pustules. I love sick sex shit, like, that within reason. Like, I just love gross shit, right? But this is so refreshing. Like, the Gardens of Ynn is so, so refreshing. Emmy mentions in the opening crawl of the text something like the default setting is sunlight, right? Is sunshine. And I really like that, or the default weather, rather. I think that's so great. When I was reading the book, like you, I had this sense of a beautiful place that is sort of, I don't know if gone to seed is the right way of putting it, but like definitely like just, kind of like decayed, right? Like just completely left untended and with all of these like little, vestiges of the previous culture that sort of held sway there and little peaks in the seams of this sort of like strange machinery that keeps it all going, right? Like I just love it, but you put it so well. So yeah, I have nothing more to add to that.
I mean, it's great that you mentioned the machinery as well. I think that's a really nice touch, which actually, I'm saying that it's a creation of kind of copying things that pre-existed, but actually the existence of the machinery underneath the world, I think adds something to it so that it's not just kind of a Moondial, the role-playing game, but rather it's there's something else going on there. There's a little kind of Westworldy element of hidden machinery. And of course, that hints at something that you'll find later on as you explore, which is the idea of thorns, the idea of something moving around that is not apparent from the surface. And so, yeah, I think that's a very nice, strange touch that kind of elevates it above being simply an exercise in kind of recreating a certain kind of genre.
Let's talk about the idea of thorns a bit, because that's something that I know we both really liked about this book. So just so listeners have the proper context, the idea of thorns is this Well, it's just what it sounds like, actually. It is literally an idea of thorns. It is defined as a sentient being, but it has no physical form. It's sort of a sort of mimetic horror, right? It is this thing that gets in your head and begins to affect how you see everything. So, and the very first bits of it are you begin to see all plant life as having thorns, right? Just that little slight intrusion into your reality, right, is what the idea of thorns does. And that just kind of grows and grows until it eventually sort of like spreads out beyond you and into the real world. And we see lots of, I would say, similar concepts in kind of similar fiction. For example, what is it in The Neverending Story? The Nothing, I think. Yeah, the Nothing is kind of like a similar idea, right? Like this concept of nothingness that is just kind of just making something disappear, right? Like replacing something with nothing, right? It's a similar idea. And it's sort of like presented as a monster, which I think is super interesting, right? It's like in the bestiary. So I love it. It gives the whole thing it gives it like a sort of implied historical weight, because suddenly you now know what happened to the beings who created the garden, these elf-like Sitha, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, or something like that.
That's the she.
Oh, is it she? Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay, well.
As in Banshee, yeah. Anyway.
Okay, very good. No, thanks. I appreciate that. The she, this idea of, there's like a historical weight to it, right? It's like, okay, now you know what happened to them, right? And it just, I don't know, it kind of like takes this very, I wouldn't say pleasant setting, but this light sort of like airy setting, and gives it this undercurrent of almost like Lovecraftian horror, which I think is terrific.
Yeah, and I think this is the kind of thing that in some ways OSR games handle this particularly well. I think you'll see this kind of reality warping content in a lot of things like Lamentations of the Flame Princess adventures. And I think one of the reasons it works so well is because you're generally using a rule set that focuses on the kind of more measurable aspects of life. So whereas if you were to introduce the idea of thorns into your game of Monster Hearts, for example, A, that would be awesome. But B, it would not work in quite the same way as it does here, because, you've got a move that's gaze into the abyss. It's sort of expected that in some way things that affect your mind or things that are weirdly magical might happen. Whereas in, if you're running this with, what have you, your variant of OD&D, you'll be going along thinking about hit points and rations and which way to navigate and so on. And suddenly you've got a monster that attacks your ability to, or your correct understanding of the world. And so it's kind of completely latching onto a system that you previously understood, and now perhaps you don't.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about the idea of thorns also is one of the ways it functions mechanically is it actually attacks a stat that you can acquire in the game called your sense of self, right? And that actually dovetails nicely with another thing I like about the game, which is how Emmy has created custom procedures to accomplish certain things in the fiction, right? And that's something we've talked about really liking about other books in the past, and I like it here too. And sense of self is one of those. It's a stat that you get it's essentially a number, and you get it by adding up certain ability scores or whatever. And every time certain things happen to you, or you interact with certain things, or if you get into a battle with the idea of thorns, your sense of self gets like lowered and lowered each time until you have kind of lost your sense of self. I will tell you that when I played in the sessions that I played in, my character was affected by this. I had a sense of self score that was like lowering and lowering. And every time it happened, Horst kind of posed some questions to me that interrogated like how I was losing my sense of self. And I loved it. I mean, it was like my favorite part of those sessions by far. I mean, all just the general sort of coolness of the setting is great, but in a sort of personal sense, as far as like my character goes, I loved that idea of the sense of self, and really terrific. Although I can't remember if the Gardens of Ynn actually tells you or gives advice on how the GM should help the player interrogate what it means to lose your sense of self. I can't remember if it's more than just a sort of score that causes your character to retire, but that's how we did it. It was really great fun.
And just before we move on to things we have questions about, I also would like to note there is a section entitled What Happens If the Idea of Thorns Gets into the Real World. And what I like about this is firstly that it exists, because that's a useful thing to know, like the timeline of how your real world setting would be affected by it. But what I really, really like about it is it doesn't end the world. Like, because, how many times can you save the world? It's a set of stakes that become a bit boring. And in fact, the last step of it, I think, or the penultimate step, is that after a decade, the idea of thorns is pushed back and contained. So things have changed and probably awful events have happened during the 10 years. But if your PCs literally achieve nothing to combat the idea of thorns, the rest of the planet will eventually sort themselves out and deal with it.
Yeah, it's a good touch. Let's go to questions. I think our questions, as I'm looking at the notes here, are pretty similar.
Yeah,
Maybe?
Actually, yes.
Yeah, I think they're pretty similar. So my question was background, something we discussed quite a lot after the game that Horst ran for us was, what is the value in doing the Gardens of Ynn in the manner suggested by the introduction? Why not just roll some things up beforehand, or better yet, pick the things you like best to give the players an optimized experience? And your question was, Tom?
My question is, there seems to be a lot of die rolling in here that you cannot do in advance. And in fact, I've seen the author online suggesting that you do not do it in advance because it has to change dynamically. And my question then is, how much of a hassle is that relative to the amount of fun it generates?
Why don't we handle that first? I think they're connected ideas, connected questions. Yeah. I'll tell you from my experience as a player. The way it worked is, if we decided to go deeper and go to another level, go to another part of the garden, Horst would tell us, discuss things amongst yourselves as characters while I roll up the new thing.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's good.
And that's what we did. We kind of had like little side conversations. It was like the conversations our characters were having in those liminal traveling moments between locations, which Emmy says are meant to be kind of boring, right? The important stuff is like the locations themselves, not the traveling to and from. And so that's what we did. Like, while Horst rolled the stuff up, we kind of chatted in character about what was going on. It worked okay. I mean, occasionally it felt a little forced and a little artificial, but it was fine. I thought it worked. I thought it worked fine. Of course, I can't speak for Horst's experience of actually rolling it up and doing it. He did, as I recall, mention that he liked the surprise of doing it. Like, he found it to be pleasurable as a GM to discover those things in play. I know that's something you like too, Tom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, to come to your question, I think there probably lies the value of it. I think there are two things. So there's the surprise of everyone discovering what's going to happen at the same time. But also there's the infamous PBTA injunction to disclaim responsibility. And in this case, what you're doing is you're disclaiming responsibility to the whims of the dice. And I think also, and that's to do with the idea of the shifting nature of the garden, so that every time you go in, it's a bit different. And I think that, as per the suggestion of kind of picking out your favorite bits or front loading it, I think you could do that as a kind of compromise. Maybe you'd pick your highlights that you like, and that's the first time you go in, you'd have people encounter those. And then the next time they go in, then you start rolling to see how things have changed. I think that would be a kind of nice way to, make sure that you're definitely going to hit the bits that you want to, but without losing that sense of randomness.
I think that's right. At the time when we were discussing it after our game, I was very much like, yeah, this was cool, but I personally would like to just go through beforehand and pick all the stuff out, because that's the kind of GM I am, right? I want to have like big moments all the time, right? And as I've been thinking about it, I actually kind of like your suggestion there of maybe having the first location be something you crafted, right? In order to have like a nice big punchy start and then roll it from there. I think that's a good compromise. All right, cool. So let's go to the chain lightning round. Tom, kick us off.
The cemetery on page 25 contains this description of animate skeletons. They can talk and are flamboyant and verbose in their exaggerated emotions. If damaged but not killed, they can use their action to reassemble themselves, healing all damage.
Mine is also from the same section. I like some of the things that you might discover the animate skeletons doing at night. such as having a formal debate over the theological implications of their continued existence. Playing in a poker tournament, they gamble with teeth. The losers are near toothless. The winner has teeth jammed all over their skull. And wailing and shaking and apologizing for their sins.
Living creme brulee monsters are healed by fire damage, because of course.
From the fleshy entry in location details, we have one of the bits of text that is a little bit more in that sort of gross lamentations-y kind of stuff I normally prefer. This is a little side trek into that. It says, quote, "This section of garden has all the plants made of meat, bone, and gristle rather than vegetable matter. Trees are pillars of bone with rib-like or hand-like branches and leaves that are flaps of red skin. Grass is instead long strips of soft flesh like on the inside of the throat. Flowers made of delicately folded mucous membranes sit on the end of cartilage stems. Here and there an eyeball peers out of the soil, blinking placidly. Or a set of fleshy fingers grasps at your ankles. It smells like an abattoir or a hospital. The meat is all edible if you cook it, but even then eating it causes you to roll for union alterations."
Absolutely grotesque. Meanwhile, in the statuary, there is a, and I quote, 1 in 6 chance that one of the statues is of a famous missing person from the real world.
Love that. Finally, there is a parasitic location detail where we are told that you might have tiny crabs with faces of children that live in your gut and eventually burst out of you. I just like the gross stuff, right?
Yeah, basically. Let's press on to the Expert Delve.
It's the Expert Delve. Tom, what are we talking about today?
We are talking about what I have pretentiously termed other spaces, with capital letters at the front, in fantasy and horror games. So what I mean by that is, well, inspired by the suggestion in the book that the Gardens of Ynn is not to be used as a setting for an entire campaign by itself. I think Emmy suggested it would be at least 3 or 4 sessions, maybe more, but not like a long running, that you won't just always be adventuring in there, but rather you attach it as a kind of second realm to your ongoing campaign world. And it's a place that people can choose to go or, flee to once they know the secret for how to get into the gardens, which I don't think we've mentioned this, is you have to draw a gate on a garden wall and then make an inscription and then it works.
Any garden wall, right? Mm-hmm. It's something like, here lies the entrance to Yin by way of...
And then wherever you are. Yeah.
Wherever you're at. Yeah, it's pretty clever. Well, I think the way out also is similar, right?
It is similar,
like,
yes.
Yeah, it's like, here is where I'm going by way of the Gardens of Ynn.
Yeah, the trick is finding it. And so other examples in media would be the Upside Down in Stranger Things is another kind of different realm, probably too many to really list. And so I think there are a few different reasons you would want to have these, and I've broken them into, well, the first one is utility, right? So a lot of the time can be something, just a way of getting from A to B, but super quick, like warp space in every science fiction game ever, because planets are too far away from each other. Also for atmosphere, so just the idea of having a separate dimension helps you to portray a fantastic world, to coin a phrase, because the idea that it exists makes things more fantastical. You can also do it for thematic reasons, so like reflect the kind of underlying themes of your main world by putting imagery, characters, and so on into the other space that does that in a more kind of abstract way. So something like in Twin Peaks, the Lodge would be a classic example of that, I think. And then finally, of course, the threat. So this is where the Upside Down in Stranger Things is. That's where the monster lives, and it's where the things come out of. A particularly good game version of that is the Nightmares Underneath, I think, where the dream realms are things you have to go into, because if you don't go in and shut them down, the monsters will come out and hassle you.
Yeah, this is terrific. So I guess we're going to just proceed by talking about some examples of these different things: utility, atmosphere, theme, and threat.
So for an initial example, a while back, I ran a quite long game of World of Blades, as I called it, because it was like World of Dungeons, but with Blades in the Dark play sheets. And that was set in Shakespeare's Verona. And the other space I had in that was the idea that if you knew the right words, you could step into paintings, and it could be any painting. And then and this had kind of both theme and utility. The utility part was that by having another space, at one point, a street gang that had learnt the trick were using it as a hideout. But also, if you stepped into a work of art by a particular artist, you could travel through this other space, taking, days or months if it was only distantly connected, but into another work by the same artist and then step out of it into the real world, wherever it was. So if you wanted to break into someone's castle, a quite good idea was to find out which paintings they had and obtain something by the same painter. And so that was the kind of utility aspect of it. But then thematically, I wanted to ground the whole thing of it being not just sort of a fantasy city with Verona tacked on it, but the idea that it would be a sort of Shakespeare's kind of real, but not really Uchronia, which therefore had real artists and kind of characters that you could at least refer to, if not actually meet. And also just kind of keep having an excuse to show more or less period art to the players to reinforce the kind of visual aesthetic of the setting.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about, you mentioned these, what we're calling other spaces. You mentioned there being the utility aspect, and I'm particularly struck by the idea of these other spaces being used as a medium for fast travel from one place to another. And I really, really love this. And I'll tell you why. I think that it's very common in some fantasy fiction, and it's very, very common in role-playing games that I've observed, and sometimes am even guilty of doing this myself, where you just open a door and step into another world, or you teleport to just some other place, right? And you're just there. Mm-hmm. I think that you can enhance and enrich the idea of traveling to another time or space by using these other spaces, right? I think the use of these other spaces as being like a sort of travel medium or a place that you kind of go through to connect the dots or whatever, I think it really, really enriches the experience. I think it adds a lot of heft to the moment. And I do it a lot. So I'll give you some examples, since that's what we're kind of doing for this Expert Delve as examples. So in the recently concluded Dungeon World AP on our other podcast, We Hunt the Keepers, for the series called The Path to Dim Carcosa, we had the player characters travel from the not Earth, standard world that we were in to Carcosa. And we actually spent probably half a whole session, about an hour and a half, on the actual journey part. But the journey wasn't just we're traveling through space or whatever. It was an other space. That was the journey. They were around this tree, and this tree existed in multiple dimensions and planets and locations at once. So so the tree itself was an other space, right? And so we spent a good portion of the session just being around the tree and kind of having the characters in a sort of dream-like fugue kind of move or kind of be blinked into all these different dimensions and realms that this tree existed in simultaneously. And that just really, really made the final arrival at Carcosa, I think, just have a lot more heft. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, I like that. How did you handle that kind of mechanically, or in terms of the players' just input to it? Would you ask them sort of questions? I mean, was it kind of you appear somewhere, you tell me what it's like, or was it
basically, yeah. I can't remember my exact procedure, but it was something like that, right? It was you kind of tell me what this looks like, and I might ask a couple of follow-up questions to help flesh that out. Once I kind of told them what the basic mechanic, the fictional mechanic of moving to Carcosa was going to be. There was no actual game mechanic associated with it. It was just a sort of just kind of talking around the table kind of thing.
Yeah, that's interesting though, because it is still world building, even if they're worlds you only glimpse. I've always been somewhat haunted by in The Magician's Nephew, which is the kind of chronologically first of the Chronicles of Narnia. When they travel to Narnia, they do it through this intermediary realm, which is full of kind of pools of water. And I think if you look into them, you see a glimpse of the world that you would go to if you dive into it. So, of course, C.S. Lewis just describes these glimpses of loads of different worlds, which we never get to explore because they only go to one. But the fact that they exist changes the tenor of the one that you actually do see. So your Carcosa is affected by the realms that you don't visit. You know?
Absolutely, right. Yeah, it makes you feel like there's a whole vastness out there, right? And that's this like idea of the other space, like operating in this way. And I think it's pretty cool. Another thing I've done is I have run this short campaign several times called The Castle of the Dreaming Doors. And what it is there's a castle, and kind of like the Upside Down in Stranger Things, this castle has an alternate dimension attached to it, right? A sort of reverse dimension. And there's a particular room in the castle where you smoke some kind of strange opium and you enter this dream state, but which is actually like you're actually transported to the astral plane, right? I always use the astral plane as my medium of travel from place to place, right? Yeah. And the astral plane is the other space, right? And sometimes I present it with different aesthetics or set dressing or whatever, but the idea is it's the astral plane. I imagine the Gardens of Ynn exist on the astral plane, for example, right? In my personal fantasy fiction, that's what it is. So in the Castle of the Dreaming Doors, you go to this sort of, upside down version of the castle, and you can suddenly walk into these little doors that the characters found in the real world. There were these, little tiny doors that they found, but they had no function. They were just little doors that opened up to nothing, like just wall. Mm. But in the upside down version, they opened up into other planes of existence, right? But the castle itself had its own strange ecology, right? There were travelers in the castle. There were people who had been there for a long time. It had a certain sort of like strange decay, kind of like the Gardens of Ynn. And so, yeah, it was one of these other spaces, right? And it functioned as a method of travel.
And then one I'd like to mention that I've used quite recently, and not really at my own initiative, but because it came up in Monster Hearts, where we have a Fae character who can therefore travel to Fairyland. And that got used as a means of transport, but it was very interesting the way the decision to do that got made. And so we've been talking about these sort of other spaces that I would say are very creative and interesting. You can see the kind of antecedents, like the big tree is obviously similar to Yggdrasil from Norse myths, but it's not quite the same, and so on. But of course, the realm of fairy, there's nothing particularly creative about that. But that's what is great about it, is because it's freighted with cultural meaning. You don't have to tell someone that, this might be your only way to, that basically they were using it to, these kids are being kind of arrested by some army dudes who are sealing off an area, and they had to kind of quietly step behind a tree and out of sight and into the fairy realm, as one does. But they didn't come to this lightly, because everyone knows the thing about the fairy realm is that you go there and time kind of gets messed up and you might not come back exactly when you want to or in the state that you desire. And so, to my surprise, using what I was thinking of as kind of a pretty hackneyed other space. I mean, it's been recorded since, the earliest days of the English language and writing, isn't it? But in fact, it was great for just that reason, because they didn't have to be told what the threats or problems might be or opportunities, because everyone had it kind of in their imagination anyway.
Well, I think that's the strength of the Gardens of Ynn too, right? I mean, as many interesting, unique things that it has, it also pretty plainly wears its Alice in Wonderland on its sleeve, right? I mean, and I think that people's familiarity with that sort of like fantasy fiction like helps. It certainly helped me when I was playing. Like, it helped me really, really like orient into this space,
Sure. I mean, I think probably for European readers, it has a kind of quite slightly different resonance than Alice. I don't think it's Alice first for me at any rate, but I do see that. Yeah, it's certainly that kind of manicured lawns and civilized people.
What would be your first one?
For me, like I say, it's just all those, like, Chronicles of Narnia, I would say probably is the first thing I would think of, But you're right, though. It's that kind of where you encounter someone and they'll be doing something quizzical, and you should ask them what they're doing, and they'll kind of interrogate you as to what your business is and whether you are traveling with a porpoise. Yeah, so to bring that back then to this idea of, theme, utility, atmosphere, and so on. And actually, I'd like to make a quick side note about theme, which is even if you want to include another space and other space purely for the utilitarian aspects, as transport or as somewhere for the monsters to live, you should consider the theme anyway, because it's going to affect how your whole game comes off. So, for example, if you're running a kind of standard medieval fantasy, but the dimension that the monsters are hiding in resembles a sort of 1960s retro-futuristic city in the sky, that's great, but it's really going to change the perception of everything that you're doing. So you want to think about how it's going to affect your main setting. But no, the question I was ambling towards is, what then do you think, out of these categories, how does the Gardens of Ynn work best?
Definitely, as far as being able to portray a fantastical setting, I think that's the easiest of these little categories we've defined. Mm-hmm. Certainly the threat, the idea of thorns, lives there. Certainly utility. I guess it could be utility and theme, I think, depend on what else is going on in the campaign world.
That's true,
right?
Yeah.
I mean, if, like we were just running a short series focused on the Gardens of Ynn, so there was no, there was no traveling going on. We had a little MacGuffin, 6 little boys that we were retrieving, or 4 or something that we were retrieving from some Dutch trading family or something. I don't know. And, we were in Lamentation setting. Right?
Ah, yes. Okay.
Yeah. So I guess it depends on what's going on in your campaign setting. Like if you need it to be a place to, a way to get to another thing, then I suppose. And the themes, I think, also probably pretty heavily depend on what else is going on in your world. I mean, what would you say are the universal transportable themes from the Gardens of Ynn?
I think it has to be atmosphere and probably utility. The threat one is interesting because the idea of thorns is in there, but I don't think the idea of thorns is a bit like the Undead Army in Deathfrost Doom. It only gets triggered when you blunder in there and start thinking about it. So in that sense, it's not kind of functioning in the sort of, this is the enemy's base camp means of the threat. It's sort of something that is discovered. But I suppose you could say that about its usefulness as transport as well. You have to go in and then figure out how to get out. And at that point, it becomes a way to travel. So it's interesting like that. But mostly I would say it's the atmosphere. Once you've added this formal abandoned garden into your campaign world, that is going to colour everything else, because there'll be the sense that there's always this place with a nice lawn that you could escape to if you could just get to a garden wall with a piece of chalk.
Something I like about the Gardens of Ynn that I could see being used in my own larger campaign world, if I were going to use it in that way, is this idea of history and place. I think that is a really interesting theme that you could explore with the Gardens of Ynn. I want to just throw out another other place that I've used in my campaigns, kind of similar to the Gardens of Ynn, actually, except my thing predates the Gardens of Ynn by quite a bit, called Kenduin's Rose Garden. And in my campaign world, there was this not Galadriel elf maiden figure called Kenduin, who was known to be a sort of shaper of the world, right? She was a legendary figure. She was a figure who went to war with the gods. She was a figure who brought math and magic, to people and all that kind of stuff, right? And she has her hand in shaping how the world is. And this is a common established thing in the history of my campaign world, not the one I'm running currently, but the one I was running back then. And so the characters eventually got a chance to go to this astral plane space called Kenduin's Rose Garden. It was actually a labyrinth. And what was really great about it, and this labyrinth was the sort of astral prison the gods had put my not Galadriel in, right? And what was great about it is as they explored this rose garden labyrinth thing, they encountered evidence that Kenduin had her hand in other worlds also, not just theirs, right? So, for example, I think they found the Holy Grail, or a little mausoleum where it was heavily implied that was the Holy Grail was inside of it, right? Or they encountered she had sort of Jason and Medea trapped in amber, kind of having this perpetual argument, right? It was that kind of thing, right? And what I really loved about that was it was this strange other space, like we've been talking about, that really reinforced this idea of Kenduin as this puppet master, the uber puppet master, right? Over so many things. And there's little touches of that in the Gardens of Ynn too, right? Like that one little detail that you called out in the Chain Lightning round about how you might find a statue of a missing person from the real world, right? It's this hint that the garden like stretches into all kinds of different spaces. And I kind of love that. I think and I just want to kind of throw that out there as like a sort of a thematic idea, right? Like there are other things too. Like you could very easily take the Gardens of Ynn you could have like a campaign about exploring the history of the Seath, right? Or maybe there's some like particular artifact that's been a quest object or a MacGuffin for a long time, and we discover that it's like really fundamentally tied to the Gardens of Ynn. I think there are ways you could do cool little things like that, right? So yeah, this has been fun. I think there's a lot to be said about these other spaces and kind of how you can use them in your game. And I think we've come up with some pretty good examples. I mean, the idea of like atmosphere, I think is the easy one, right? Probably the one that we don't have to talk about, but definitely like working with theme and utility is super, super interesting. Anything else you want to say about it, Tom?
No, I think that's pretty much covered it for me.
All right, let's move on to the companion adventures. Codex Storm, the newest issue of the Gauntlets RPG zine, is now available in our Patreon feed. Codex Storm is all about fantasy. Here's what you'll find inside. To the Halls of the Stormlord, an epic adventure for macchiato monsters inspired by Norse myth. The Rubble of Kiraminar's Sanctum, a collection of elements for Dungeon World. The Subgothi of Storms, or Lightning in a Bottle, a journey scenario for 5e and other fantasy games. A Murder in Port Tam, which is a wild chase scenario for the Black Hack. Our newest miscellany, 36 unnatural weather phenomena, 5 pieces of beautiful art, and a custom layout by Ollie Jeffrey. To get Codex Storm, just make a $4 or higher pledge to the Gauntlet Patreon in August. Thanks. It's the Companion Adventures. Why don't we start with films? I think that Alice in Wonderland is a pretty easy touchstone here. And given that, I am going to recommend an Alice in Wonderland movie you may not have heard of or and almost certainly haven't seen, or there's a really small chance you've seen it, listeners. It is the 1988 film called Alice by Czech director Jan Svankmajer, and I'm certain I've messed that name up. And I watched this probably, about 20 years ago, so my memory of it's a little hazy, but boy, oh boy, if you want to talk about like an Alice in Wonderland movie that is just off the rails different compared to the normal sort of Wonderland presentation, this is it. It is surreal. It has lots of stop motion animation. The director discards most of Lewis Carroll's words and replaces them with his own words. It's gross, it's dingy, it's just weird. It's just a strange, weird, fucked up movie. But what I love about it though is it's such a trip to watch. Like you're watching it and you kind of wonder like, oh my God, like I feel like I feel like there's this whole like other reality that this director experiences that I am having a glimpse into, and you're either there for it or you're not. I mean, you'll know within 20 minutes whether this movie is for you. Okay. You'll watch the first 20 minutes and be like, nope. Or you will be like, huh, interesting. And you will keep going. Just a weird, fucked up, strange interpretation of Alice in Wonderland. And for, I don't know, I'm just suggesting it because there's so many easy Alice suggestions here, and I'm going to go with a weird one.
Yeah, good job. Okay, so in that case, my film suggestion is going to be one which is in some places whimsical, but, trigger warning, does open with a Kate Winslet murdering someone with a brick sequence. So be aware of that. And that is Heavenly Creatures, which was, I think it's a Peter Jackson film, isn't it? It's from 1994. Mm-hmm. And it's about these two girls in New Zealand in the 50s, I want to say, who become fast friends. And when it comes time to separate them, they don't want to go, and that's why they do a murder. This was a famous thing that really happened in New Zealand. And the thing that's of interest here is the sort of fantasy sequences of the kingdom of Barovnia, or the fourth world, which is their sort of weird heaven they think they'll go to, that they kind of create between them. And it's this, sort of fairy tale realm of, princes and castles and queens and so on. But it's all in a kind of slightly scary claymation way, and it's just weird and off-putting, and I think it's definitely worth a watch. One of those girls actually became a best-selling crime writer in Canada, apparently, when she grew up. So there you go.
I have one more film suggestion, which is the collective works of Georges Méliès, the French director, one of the very first film directors ever.
Yeah.
And pioneer of science fiction and visual effects. I think that his films capture an aesthetic that I think is probably appropriate, a good touchstone for the Gardens of Ynn, at least as I imagine the Gardens of Ynn. This sort of whimsy, this fantasy, this like beautiful organic quality, but also with like lots of machinery and nods to technology and things like that. And I think that's a great fit for Gardens of Ynn.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Georges Méliès is just amazing. I mean, if you see these films, you've definitely seen a clip, which is the one where a rocket lands in the moon's eye. That's the famous one. But just all of these, this is a guy who looked at just the moving picture at a time when the state of the art was roughly, maybe if we do a close-up on someone, that will give this shot more impact. Or, Eisenstein was just figuring out montage. And he went, pretty sure I could fly some people to the moon with this thing. And then he did. So, yeah, what a guy. Okay, so let's talk then. I would like to talk about music briefly. My recommendation is Pictures at an Exhibition by Modest Mussorgsky. And the reason for that is because it's a sort of eclectic piece. It has a recurring theme, which is the promenade, walking around an art gallery. And then the idea is you're looking at different pictures, and they include, so that means there's a segment called The Gnome, one about Baba Yaga and her scary hut on chicken feet, and various other scenes that you see. And so because of that, the music is kind of very different and seemingly a bit random, and seems to, the themes return, but always a bit changed. And I think that matches the feel of the Gardens of Ynn very well.
I'm going to go with a short story called The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Do you know that one, Tom?
I do not, no.
The Yellow Wallpaper is fantastic. I don't want to say too much about it. I don't normally believe in spoilers, but here's one where I don't want to spoil it for you. It's fairly short. Go read it. I'm pretty sure it's public domain. You can get it pretty easily. But the reason why I'm suggesting it, and it'll make sense to you when you go read it, listeners, it's this idea of mimetic horror, of the idea of thorns. The Yellow Wallpaper has a lot of that, right? This idea of a visual or a concept sort of creeping over you and taking over is very powerful. And I think it reminds me a lot of the idea of thorns. And it's also a really fantastic story. Go read it. It's so good.
Terribly mysterious. My next recommendation is just very vague, but you're going to have to bear with me here. So this is slightly offbeat children's TV, which is, I'm thinking of things like the recent-ish British show In the Night Garden, which is designed to kind of help children go to sleep, unlike most frenetic TV shows. So it's set in a garden that the main character travels to on a sailing boat when he falls asleep. And there's things like a strange train that changes in size depending on which characters are getting into it or out. And let me tell you from personal experience, if a 3-year-old starts explaining the plot of an episode to you and you don't know what he's doing, it's creepy. I just remember this time when my son was sitting in his bedroom and he started talking, said like, oh, there's the children all climbing in the bed. She wants to go to sleep, but the children are all on the bed. I'm like, what are you talking about? And I gradually figured out he's talking about a thing where the tiny Pontipines, who are a little family of red people, sometimes described as, even when there's 10 of them, they're barely there at all by the narrator, had climbed into another character's bed to go to sleep. But that was what he was talking about. But without context, it was freaky. And then there's also a whole kind of genre of, again, kind of the BBC shows I grew up watching, which have this thing of often taking place in presumably easy to rent stately homes around the length and breadth of Britain with big kind of formal gardens. One example is Moondial, which I tried to rewatch on YouTube recently. It's terribly stagey, so skip the acting and just kind of look at the bits where they're exploring nocturnal gardens. And then there's this also, if you can find it, a thing that airs on Baby TV. So you can see this whole parenthood thing is really channeling itself into my gaming now. I think it's originally Canadian because it was sort of originally in French. It's called Grandpa's Gallery. And it has a slightly creepy theme tune that sort of goes, where is Grandpa? Where do you think he hides? And so this little kid has to go searching for Grandpa. I never
want to find out.
Yeah. He goes searching for Grandpa every episode in the art gallery. And Grandpa is always hiding inside a painting. And it's often quite modernist stuff like Miro or, well, Gauguin, maybe not that modern. And so the kid has to climb into the painting and then so the ballet dancers will come to life and dance around or what have you. And it's just this really, if you watch any of these kind of things which involve, well, alternate realms and kind of give yourself a little lens of what if this was just really sinister? Then you've got a lot of inspirational material, I think.
Oh, fuck that. Grandpa needs to stay right where the fuck he is. I'm not here for that. I'm going to suggest one last thing, a gaming thing, and that is the first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Manual of the Planes. And let me tell you why. So in the Expert Delve, we talked about using these other spaces as a medium, right, to explore ideas and for the utilitarian purpose of traveling from one place to another. And to the extent that you want some rules for how this might work, some rules underpinning all of it, I think the Manual of the Planes is a great place to go. It has a lot to say about, if you're going for a standard fantasy thing, it has a lot to say about how the outer planes connect up, the astral plane and how it functions, the various rules of the ethereal plane and all these other things. And I love it. I've used it for years and years. I still use it as a foundational, almost document of what are the rules of interdimensional travel, right? How does it work? This is how it works. And I sort of, interpret it, in that manner. That little thing I mentioned earlier, the Castle of the Dreaming Doors, each of the little dreaming doors led to a different outer plane. And you knew which outer plane it was based off the color of the door, and the colors of those doors corresponded to the colors of the colored pools in the Manual of the Planes, the color telling you which outer plane it connected up to. So I kind of used that idea, sort of translated that idea into my game. I like it better than, say, Planescape or later things that came in D&D that related to the outer planes and things, because Planescape, as awesome as it is, and it's very fucking awesome, Planescape really has its thumb on the scale in terms of how this is all supposed to look, right? Whereas the Manual of the Planes is pretty loose. You're kind of free to interpret it, which I find more enjoyable.
And is the first edition Manual of the Planes readily available to today's gamer?
I think in PDF, yeah, on drive-thru, pretty sure.
Cool.
Before I sign off, I would like to congratulate our producer, Paul, and my co-host, Tom, for winning a silver 2018 Emmy for Best Role-Playing Game Podcast.
Oh, thank you. Very well done to you too, Jason.
Thank you, Tom. And listeners, thank you so much for voting for us. The eventual winners are determined by vote, so we absolutely appreciate you supporting us. It was great. I mean, it was lovely just to be nominated because many, submissions get entered for nominations, and we were chosen for that by the judges, but winning feels really good too.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very pleasant surprise for me. I didn't even know we'd been submitted. So when we even got a nomination, I was surprised. And yeah, one thing that we don't really do on Fear of a Black Dragon is read out feedback, because I think it's a bit tacky when people do that. But we do love the positive feedback. We also do take on board the negative feedback. We'll bitch about you, in private a little bit, but then we will grudgingly take on board your negative feedback. So, this plus, voting for us in an Any Awards situation, it's all very much appreciated. So thank you so much.
And listeners, that's our show. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. If you'd like to get in touch with The Gauntlet, I recommend going to Twitter and tweeting at us at GauntletRPG. You may also find us on G+. Just go to the community section of G+, and search for The Gauntlet. You will find us there. We have a website, gauntlet-rpg.com, where we are now publishing a daily blog, which has all kinds of varied and interesting articles going up. So go check that out. And we are on Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. If you love your Any Winning podcast, please keep it alive by supporting it financially. Tom, thanks so much.
And Jason, thank you.
Thanks, listeners. Take care.